2 Timothy is a kind of a swan song for Paul. The man had quite a prolific teaching experience, but he had a rough go of it. If you look back in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, before we get into our text, you can see something of the nature of his struggles. I think it's interesting what he lists, but also how he concludes the press that he is under. In 2 Corinthians 11, beginning in verse 22, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews I 5 times received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils of the city, in perils of the wilderness, in perils of the sea, in perils of false brethren, in weariness and toil and sleeplessness, often in hunger and thirst and fastings, often in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things, there were more. What comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. I always admire some of the little things that I catch, the nuances of visits I make with people. I've enjoyed thoroughly getting to know people in the Park Heights congregation. They're my family. Y'all are all my family. Would like to get to know you more and better. I think the elders made a command decision. I may be on for another month. So I'm good with that, and give me another opportunity to visit and do more work here. But sometimes when I'm visiting some of the members of the Lord's body, particularly those that have not been able to come as often as they would like, certainly Marion, others, I was visiting Bobby, and every time I visit Bobby Cathy, and the last time I saw him, he was in the hospital. I haven't quite made it over to his house yet because he got home. But one of the things that is characteristic about Bobby is that before we get hardly a second into any conversation about how we're doing, what's going on, he asked me, how's the church? And that's so impressive to me because he wants to know about you. He's not talking about the church building. He cares less about that. He's talking about you, the membership. He's concerned about each one of us. And it just reminded me of how Paul would be able to end his life by saying, I fought a good fight. I have been concerned. I mean, I've been through all of this, but the concern for the churches, that's what weighs on me. And so he goes into this explanation of where he is as he's looking at the end of his life. And if historians are correct, and again, that's just historians and what they have looked up and researched, he died not long after penning this letter. He was being persecuted pretty heavily, and Paul ended up also dying a martyr's death. But nevertheless, he talks about himself being poured out as a drink offering. That kind of is an indicator that I'm about to die. And the question would be, if you had something to say, what would you say if you knew that you were about to die? And this kind of makes this whole text very interesting as to what was important to him to explain. And what's interesting is he starts this chapter by charge that he gives to Timothy, you need to preach the word. Because there's going to come a time, if it already hadn't existed with a lot of them, but there's going to come a time when they're not going to endure sound doctrine. So you need to preach the word. And there's a reason, because the preaching of the word gives people an opportunity to be on one side or another. And there's no gray area. There's no middle fence one can ride. You're either righteous or you're not righteous. You're God's child or you're not God's child. There's no middle ground. And when he tells Timothy here, I fought a good fight and I'm ready to go, he then begins to put flesh on the bones, as it were, where the rubber meets the road, telling about Christians and where they are. Now I want you to notice how he describes some of the members of the Lord's body that he is in contact with. Also, individuals who are having an influence on not only him, but other Christians also. And there's some very instructive things that we can learn from this. And remember, keeping in contact, this is his last message to Timothy. If you could say something one more time to someone, what would you say? This is what he is telling his son in the faith. He had a connection with Timothy. First thing he talks about, which is very sad, is the fact that Demas forsook him. Now, Crescens and Titus, I would not assume to associate their departure to wherever they went, Galatia and so forth, and Dalmatia, that it was negative. They just had left and gone there. Paul frequently sent those that were in his party to some other place to do some kind of work. But in the case of Demas, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. If you look back at Colossians 4:14, it's interesting that Luke and Demas are listed as two guys running with Paul and helping him out. And now he says in the next verse, only Luke is with me. It's been said, no matter how many people are around you, you always die alone. That's an interesting observation, because he's looking at the end of his life and he's wanting him to come to him quickly. Now he has some requests, of course. One of them is an interesting one in verse 11. He wants John Mark to be coming back and helping him out. I don't know what you recall, but it's not too far back in Acts the 15th chapter when he and Barnabas had a falling out about taking John Mark on a missionary journey. And the contention was so, phenomenal between them, they just decided to part ways. Now, that teaches me something by remote extension in this remote context, that it's okay to disagree about things that really don't matter about souls. Now, we can disagree quite strongly about them, and that's okay. There's no reason to divide. There's no reason to cause disunity. Barnabas went one way and Paul went another, and they still preached the gospel of Christ, and they still did great work for God. They disagreed on something. It was a matter of opinion. But it's interesting that Paul evidently has changed his opinion about Mark and said, hey, send me Mark. I don't know how Mark redeemed himself. There's all kinds of speculation that can go into that. And it's fascinating, some of the things that went on in the New Testament church at this time. But nevertheless, Mark was back in Paul's good graces. We never hear whether or not Paul and Barnabas ever made up, but we do hear that he called for Mark by name, which is phenomenal. Tychicus went to Ephesus, and then he tells him, and I love verse 13 because I'm a bibliophile. That's a guy that loves books. When you come, bring my cloak because I need to stay warm, but bring my books. It's the preacher, dude. I'm telling you what. You got to bring me my books because I got to have something to read here. I got to have something to study. He did also say in verse 14, there's a guy down here by the name of Alexander, and he's a coppersmith, and he did a bunch of harm to us and to me. And he said, and I like this, may the Lord repay him according to his works. You know, Paul's not wishing evil on Alexander. What he's asking for is justice. I think people misconstrue the two, confuse them a bit, think that that's being mean to ask that the Lord take vengeance on someone. And yet David did that quite frequently in the Psalms. You know, his enemies were unjust in what they were trying to do, particularly Saul, the king, trying to kill him. And yet David never would lift a hand against the king, but he did pray that those that were his adversaries, those that were antagonistic toward him, be repaid according to God's justice. I believe that is a legitimate request and prayer that we can make. That God repay those who are not being the Christians they should, or those who are not Christians and are tormenting those who are brethren. For a little bit more explanation of that, you might go to 2 Thessalonians 1 and understand that God gives us great comfort in the fact that He's going to take care of those when He comes with His angels in flaming fire and takes vengeance on those who know not God, obey not the gospel. So He knows how to take care of things. We need to leave it in His hands. But also, I'll let you notice in verse 15, because of his love for Timothy and his concern for Timothy's soul, he warned him, and by the way, this is in inspired writ, this is public, this is something everyone can read. Alexander is named by name. There's nothing wrong at all. In fact, it's important sometimes to name those antagonistic to the Lord's kingdom. I can remember 20 years ago, my first experience with trying to get serious about some of the flaws that were going on in the Lord's church through apostate preachers and teachers, and just the bare mention of Max Lucado's name was enough to get people up in arms. Oh, you shouldn't name names. Well, I beg to differ. Paul did, and he says, he warns him, beware of him. He warned Timothy about this guy. Well, you know, Romans 16:17 point blank says, mark those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine of Christ and have no fellowship with them. We got to straighten that out. That is a legitimate scriptural thing to do when people get belligerent and don't want to follow truth. You warn your other brethren about it. And so therefore, I remember 25 years ago getting raked over the coals because I mentioned that name. No, that's a scriptural concept, and we surely can mention names of those who cause grief for the church. He did lament the fact that in verse 16 that when he went before the judge, nobody was with him, but he did say that the Lord kept him in good stead when he was before the magistrate. The thing that contrasts here, and the thing that's noteworthy that we ought to look at, is there is no one here he mentions that's, by name. We know Joe Snuffy, he's okay. He shows up to worship. He's kind of there. It doesn't have anything like that at all. As a matter of fact, they're stark, polar opposite things. Demas has forsaken me. Alexander the coppersmith is an evil fellow. Watch him. And then you've got Luke is still with me. And, those kinds of things make for polar opposites of how God views people. Since Genesis 6, where the Bible talks about, and many people have misconstrued this to be heavenly beings with physical women, but when it talks about the sons of God and the daughters of men, there was a beginning there of what was very stark in the differences between those who follow God and those who don't. And that dichotomy, that division between those two categories of people has never changed. You'll find that very description all the way into Revelation, the last book in our New Testament. There is no changing with God in that regard. You're either with me or you're against me, Jesus would say. There's no middle ground. And I guess what this lesson teaches us is this good, solid preaching apostle is about to die. He's about to go. What would you tell somebody? Well, you would tell them there's two classes of people in this world, and that's it. No more. You're either with him or you're against him. That's it. No more. And it serves in part as a warning to Timothy. In fact, just a little bit earlier, he told him, hey, you need to stir up that gift that's in you, and you need to get to preaching like you should be preaching. Evidently, Timothy was kind of slacking a little. And Paul felt compelled to tell him, you need to get on the stick, get after it. In the same sense, in his last comments to Timothy, he points out there are two stark, contrasting bodies of people in this world. We need to be the ones who are with God. Totally, completely, 100%, no compromise. There is no middle ground. There is no fence riding. There is no slack time for a Christian. We are either dedicated to it or we're not. And this list of people here is just a rubber meets the road kind of deal. This is names that you put with principle. These abstract concepts about being faithful and being unfaithful are so out there in the ether. No, this is where it really matters. Because Demas forsook me, and Alexander tormented me. Luke is with me. These are real life applications of these abstract principles. That's where we are seen and understood. We can all claim to have faith, as James puts it, but if we don't have works to go with it, how do you know? How would you know about somebody's faith? Our goal is to be on the right side of God. And therefore, there needs to be no compromise, no hedging the bet, going as close as we can to the fire. We need to be totally, completely resolved and committed to God. And I believe that's what Paul's telling Timothy right here. In a roundabout way, here's a list, okay, of people on one side and people on the other. Where do you stand? Could have asked Timothy that very question. Where do you stand? And he asked us that question. Where do we stand? Are we with him or are we against him? In these examples, we can look at our lives and we can look at practical examples of things we do and don't do and ask the question, are we with God or are we not? It's clear to us, and it can be very clear to others, by what we do as to where we stand. I would invite you to listen to Paul's warning, his last words to Timothy. There are two classes of people. We know what class we should be in. I invite you to be in that class. If you need to respond for any reason, why don't you come as we stand?